This is the brief on Philippine aviation law and hijacking. From the deadly early flights of the 1950s to military-controlled airports in the 1970s, we're looking at how courts and lawmakers scrambled to build rules punishing hijackers and figure out who pays when terror strikes. First, the 1952 Ang Cho Kio case. He hijacked a flight, shot the purser, and killed the pilot for refusing to fly to Amoy. He pled guilty, getting a lighter sentence. Prosecutors appealed for the death penalty, but the Supreme Court blocked it over double jeopardy. You literally can't put someone in legal peril twice to upgrade their sentence. They also rejected the complex crime claim. It's like ordering someone at gunpoint to drive, then deciding to shoot them anyway. You didn't have to kill the pilot to coerce him. They're distinct, successive choices, not one blended crime. Second, the legislative fix. Old penal codes were clunky, so the government passed Republic Act 6235 in 1971, explicitly criminalizing plane seizures. So, if the law says you can't hijack a plane, how do we actually stop it at the gate? Well, this law gave airlines the legal muscle to search suspicious baggage and refuse uncooperative passengers. Finally, civil liability. In 1976, an MNLF hijacked flight ended in a deadly shootout. Passengers sued Philippine Airlines, but the court ruled force majeure, an unavoidable event. Since the military completely controlled airport security under martial law, blaming the airline for a hijacker slipping through is literally like suing a taxi driver because a meteor hit the cab. Ultimately, these defining cases and laws built the foundation of Philippine aviation security, establishing strict protections against double jeopardy, empowering airlines to search passengers, and shielding carriers from the financial fallout of unforeseeable acts of terror.
Welcome to this video on jurisprudence at 30,000 feet. We'll trace the evolution of Philippine aviation law, from the revised penal code to the concept of force majeure. Three major incidents shaped the legal blueprint of Philippine aviation. We'll examine cases from 1952, 1971, and 1976 that addressed air piracy, statutory regulation, and corporate liability. The 1952 hijacking of Flight PIC-38 resulted in the deaths of the pilot and a passenger. The accused, Ang Cho Kio, eventually pleaded guilty and received sentences for both deaths. In the case, the Supreme Court rejected the prosecution's, quote, complex crime model. Instead, it ruled the acts were distinct and successive, leading to two separate crimes: frustrated coercion and murder. The prosecution appealed to upgrade the penalties, but the Supreme Court blocked the appeal, relying on the double jeopardy rule. This constitutional protection prevents the state from appealing a valid conviction to increase the penalty. The Ang Cho Kio case revealed a legislative void, as general penal laws were insufficient for aircraft hijacking. The 1971 solution was Republic Act No. 6235, which explicitly criminalized air piracy. RA No. 6235 transformed the contract of carriage into a security protocol. It mandated a legal condition on every ticket, allowing the search of passengers and baggage, and granted airlines the authority to investigate suspicious packages. The 1976 MNLF hijacking of BAC 1-11 led to a gun battle. Surviving passengers sued Philippine Airlines for gross negligence, citing the failure to use metal detectors to frisk passengers. Common carriers, like airlines, must exercise extraordinary diligence for passenger safety. Under Philippine law, carriers are presumed negligent when an injury occurs. To overcome this, they must prove extraordinary diligence or that the accident was an unforeseeable, inevitable event, a caso fortuito. The caso fortuito defense requires four elements. The cause is independent of the carrier's will, the event is unforeseeable or unavoidable, performance is impossible, and the carrier did not aggravate the injury. In the Gacal versus PAL case, the court found an exception due to martial law. Letter of Instruction number 399 mandated a military takeover of airport security, making it legally impossible for PAL to perform its frisking duties. This was ruled a true force majeure. The 1952 and 1976 incidents represent two distinct legal domains. The Ang Cho Kio case was a criminal prosecution concerning complex crimes. The Gacal case was a civil liability issue, focusing on breach of contract and force majeure. Modern aviation jurisprudence rests on a triad: the revised Penal Code as the foundation, RA number 6235 as the catalyst for security protocols, and the Civil Code as the shield, balancing corporate diligence with force majeure.
We're going to dive into two absolutely terrifying hijackings that happened decades apart. They were violent, they were tragic, and they ended up forcing the Philippine legal system to answer some really fundamental questions about guilt, justice, and where responsibility truly begins and ends.
So let's go back in time. The date is December 30, 1952. What should have been just another flight turned into a nightmare. And the legal chaos that followed? Well, it created a shockwave that we can still feel in the law books today.
All right, first up, we have the case of a man named Ang Cho Kio. This story is about the brutal crimes he committed thousands of feet up in the air.
The whole thing happened so fast, it's just horrifying. Ang Cho Kio gets on a Philippine Airlines flight. He's carrying 2 pistols. Without any hesitation, he shoots and kills the purser. Then, he storms the cockpit and tells the pilot, Pedro Perales, to fly to Amoy. When the pilot refused, Ang Cho Kio just murdered him on the spot.
Well, with evidence like that, there was really no way out. Ang Cho Kio pleaded guilty, so the trial court convicted him of 2 separate murders. For killing the purser, he got 12 to 20 years. For killing the pilot, he got reckless in perpetua, which is basically life imprisonment.
But here's where it gets interesting. The prosecution looked at those sentences and thought, nope, that's not enough. They believe the law called for a much steeper price: life for the first murder and the death penalty for the second. So they did something pretty unusual. They appealed to increase the punishment.
And that single move, that appeal, brought the whole case to a screeching halt, because it raised this huge constitutional question that only the Supreme Court could answer. I mean, really think about that for a second. Let's say you've been on trial, you've been found guilty, and a judge has given you your sentence. Is it fair for the government to get a do-over, not to prove you're guilty again, but just to try and get you a tougher penalty? This is where the principle of double jeopardy comes in. You've probably heard the term. At its core, it's a shield. It protects a person from having to go through the whole nightmare of a trial and the risk of punishment over and over again for the exact same crime. So you had these 2 clashing arguments. The prosecution said, hey, this was a complex crime. The hijacking and the murder were linked, so he deserves the death penalty. But the Supreme Court said, no, we see 2 separate acts. But more importantly, the court said it doesn't even matter if the trial court got the sentence right or wrong. The real question is, can the state even make this appeal in the first place? And the court's answer was crystal clear, and it was right there in the rule book. The law explicitly says that the state cannot appeal if doing so would put the defendant in double jeopardy. It's black and white. So the court made a landmark ruling. They decided that appealing a sentence just to make it harsher is a form of double jeopardy. So Ang Cho Kio's sentences, whether you think they were too light or not, had to stand. The government doesn't get a second bite at the apple. Okay, now let's fast forward 24 years to 1976. Another hijacking, a totally different era, and a completely new legal fight. This time the focus isn't on the criminal, it's on the airline. You can really see how the entire problem had changed. In 1952, you had one lone criminal. By 1976, you're dealing with an organized terrorist group, the Moro National Liberation Front. And so the legal question does a complete 180. It's no longer about the rights of the accused, it's about the safety and rights of the passengers. And this 1976 hijacking was a long, drawn-out, terrifying event. 6 armed men took over the plane. They wanted cash, weapons, and a flight to Libya. What followed was a horrible standoff that ended in a full-on gun battle between the military and the hijackers. In the end, 10 passengers and 3 hijackers were dead. So after all that horror, the survivors and the victims' families, they wanted answers. They took Philippine Airlines to court, and their question was pretty straightforward. Was it your job to protect us, and did you fail? Are you legally responsible for what we went through? Now, the airline's response was to use a very powerful legal defense. They basically argued that this wasn't a case of them being careless. It was an event that was completely 100% out of their hands. They used a concept called force majeure. You can think of it as an act of God clause. The argument is that when some crazy, unforeseeable event makes it impossible for you to do what you promised, in this case, get passengers safely to their destination, then you can't be held legally responsible for it. But you can't just shout force majeure and expect to win. The Supreme Court has a very strict 4-part test.
The event has to be totally independent of you, it has to be impossible to see coming or avoid, it has to make your job impossible, and you can't have done anything to make the situation worse. And here is the single fact that the entire case turned on. The year was 1976. The Philippines was under martial law, and during that time, airport security wasn't the airline's responsibility, it was under the exclusive control of the Philippine military. And this right here shows you everything you need to know. The airline had exactly 0% control over security. The military had 100%. Official government documents confirmed it. So the airline's argument was simple. How can we be negligent for a security failure when we literally had no power to stop it? So, when the Supreme Court went down its 4-point checklist, the airline ticked every single box. The hijacking was completely out of their control. The court ruled it was a true case of force majeure, and Philippine Airlines was cleared of all responsibility. When you put them together, these two cases did more than just settle a couple of legal disputes. They left behind a huge legacy, setting precedents that still shape how we fly today.
And one of the most visible parts of that legacy is something you've probably seen 100 times without thinking about it. That little bit of text on your plane ticket that says you agree to be searched, that comes directly from the Anti-Hijacking Act of 1971, a law passed because of the dangers these early events brought to light. And all this leaves us with a really big question for our own time. With all the new and evolving threats out there, where do we draw that line? Where does an airline's duty to keep us safe end, and where does an unforeseeable, act of God event begin? These old cases laid the groundwork, but that debate is definitely far from over.
Usually, when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there is this expectation of precision,
Right.
You break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points to it and says, well, there it is.
Right. It's comforting. I mean, we naturally want the fractures in our world to be visible. We want them to be easily categorized and, repaired with a straightforward cast.
Exactly. But the moment you step into the world of aviation, security, and criminal law, that x-ray machine just shatters. We are looking at a legal and diagnostic landscape that is the absolute definition of muddy waters.
Oh, absolutely. It's incredibly complex.
Yeah, and today we're looking at something you probably take for granted. You buy a ticket, board a pressurized metal tube, put on your noise-canceling headphones, and, well, you land.
Right. It's just a routine A to B journey for most of us.
But the stack of sources you provided for today's deep dive reveals that commercial airplanes are actually high-stakes legal battlegrounds. We have two landmark Philippine Supreme Court cases from two entirely different eras.
Yeah, one from 1954 and another from 1990.
Right. And sitting right between them, acting as this legislative bridge, is a pivotal document, Republic Act number 62385 from 1971.
Which is such a fascinating piece of legislation.
Yeah.
Because we are going to trace a terrifying evolution today. These documents show the law desperately scrambling to catch up.
Scrambling is the perfect word for it.
It really is. Because violence in the skies mutates from isolated individual acts of terror into complex state-level security crises. And beneath the formal, often dry language of the courts, these are visceral stories.
They really are. They represent the absolute limits of the justice system when human beings are trapped 30,000 feet in the air.
Yeah, trying to balance criminal punishment, constitutional rights, and corporate liability all at once. It's a massive legal tightrope.
So we have to wind the clock back to understand the baseline here. Before the modern security apparatus existed,
Before the scanners and the liquid bans.
Right, before the moments you have to take off your shoes at the gate. How did the legal system handle a murder on a commercial flight? We are starting in 1952 with the truly harrowing realities of the Ang Cho Kio case.
The timeline is critical context here. I mean, in 1952, commercial aviation is still relatively young. We're talking about domestic island-hopping routes in the Philippines, flying propeller aircraft.
Yeah, a completely different world of travel.
Exactly. The infrastructure of aviation was built entirely around the miracle of flight itself and passenger comfort. The concept of an airplane being weaponized or serving as a sealed, mobile hostage environment
Just wasn't a thing people thought about.
No, it hadn't been codified into the legal or architectural DNA of the industry yet. You walked to the airport, handed someone a ticket, and got on the plane.
So let's lay out the precise facts of this specific flight for you. The date is December 30th, 1952. We are aboard Philippine Airline plane PIC-38.
It's just a routine domestic route, en route from Laoag to Apari, flying over the rugged terrain of the mountain province.
Right, and walking onto this flight is a man named Ang Cho Kio.
And the Supreme Court documents immediately wave a massive red flag regarding his identity. The court lists an extensive string of aliases for this single individual.
Oh, yeah, it's wild. Like Kiba, Lucio Lee, Philip Ang, Mr. Ang, Goang, Mr. Ong.
Right, he is moving through the world with a deliberate, calculated intent to obscure his true identity.
That alone suggests premeditation of something even before he steps on the tarmac. I mean, nobody needs 6 names just to take a vacation.
Exactly. But much worse than the fake names is what he brings with him. He is heavily armed.
Yeah, he carries a .45 caliber pistol and a .38 caliber pistol onto a passenger flight, which is just terrifying to think about today.
It is. And the tragedy unfolds with brutal speed. Ang Cho Kio shoots the flight's purser, Eduardo Diago. The court records state he shot him with treachery and premeditation.
Inflicting a gunshot wound that killed Diago instantly, but he doesn't stop there.
No, the situation violently escalates from a localized murder to an attempted hijacking. Ang Cho Kio storms the cockpit, tunes his weapons on the pilot, Pedro Perlas, and orders him to change the plane's route entirely.
Right, he demands to be flown to Amoy.
And Amoy is modern-day Xiamen in China. So this is no longer a domestic disturbance. This man is demanding an international diversion over open ocean.
Which requires fuel and navigational charts the plane likely doesn't have readily available for that specific route, right?
Exactly. This places pilot Perlas in an impossible situation. Perlas does not immediately comply with this illegal, wildly dangerous order.
And because Perlas fails to instantly change the course, Ang Cho Kio shoots and kills him too. 2 innocent crew members dead, thousands of feet in the air.
It is a nightmare scenario. It forces the plane into an emergency landing and brings us to the initial legal proceedings in Baguio City on March 9, 1953.
Right, so the prosecution files 2 separate criminal complaints against Ang Cho Kio. Criminal case No. 419 addresses the murder of the purser, Eduardo Diago.
And criminal case number 420 addresses the murder of the pilot, Pedro Perlas. Both complaints explicitly allege acts contrary to law, highlighting the aggravating circumstances of treachery and evident premeditation.
Now, faced with overwhelming evidence, Ang Cho Kio, standing beside his lawyers, pleads guilty to both complaints. He confesses in open court.
He does. And the trial court then hands down the sentences. For the murder of the purser, the court imposes an indeterminate punishment.
Okay, let's unpack this math.
Yeah, it's a bit complex. The minimum is 12 years of prison mayor, and the maximum is 20 years of reclusion temporal. They also mandate a 6,000 peso indemnity to Diago's heirs.
Got it. And for the pilot's death?
For the pilot's death, the trial court imposes reclusion perpetua, which translates to life imprisonment, along with another 6,000 peso indemnity to the Perlas family.
So in the Philippine penal system, which heavily inherited its structure from Spanish colonial law, these penalties carry highly specific durations and conditions, right?
That's right. Prison mayor generally ranges from 6 years and 1 day to 12 years, while reclusion temporal runs from 12 years and 1 day up to 20 years.
And reclusion perpetua entails a life sentence, usually with the possibility of pardon after 30 years, depending on the specific era's penal code application.
Exactly.
Well, I am looking at this outcome, and I imagine anyone listening is doing the exact same mental math. This man smuggled an arsenal onto a commercial flight, executed 2 men, attempted to hijack the aircraft, and openly admitted to it.
Yeah, the facts are pretty damning.
He received up to 20 years for the first execution and life imprisonment for the second. Yet, looking at the source documents, the prosecution was absolutely furious.
Oh, they were livid. They immediately appealed to the Supreme Court.
Why? What was legally insufficient about a life sentence? I mean, life is life.
Well, the prosecution's fury was rooted in the mathematical application of justice. In Philippine criminal law, base penalties are rigidly adjusted upward or downward, depending on the presence of mitigating and aggravating circumstances.
Okay, so it's a very formulaic system.
Very. The prosecution looked at the first case, the purser's murder, and argued the trial court made a profound mathematical and philosophical error.
How so?
They argued that the aggravating circumstance of evident premeditation, the fact that Ang Cho Kio acquired 2 firearms, assumed false identities, boarded a flight, and waited for the opportune moment to strike, demonstrated an immense degree of malice.
Right, he didn't just snap, this was planned. And the trial court essentially allowed that deep calculating malice to be mathematically zeroed out by the mitigating circumstance of his guilty plea.
Precisely. The trial court treated it as an equation. 1 heavy aggravating factor minus 1 heavy mitigating factor equals a baseline sentence.
Wow, I can see why the prosecution was upset.
Yeah, the prosecution fundamentally rejected that logic. They argue that a simple, "I did it" in court which merely saves the state the administrative burden of a trial, shouldn't magically wash away the horrific premeditation of an airborne execution.
So they wanted more time for the purser's death.
They demanded the sentence for the purser's death be elevated to reclusion perpetua, or life. But their outrage didn't stop there. For the murder of the pilot, life in prison was not enough.
Wait, really? What else could they ask for?
They demanded the state pull the ultimate lever, the death penalty.
Okay, this demand for the death penalty introduces one of the most fascinating legal theories in this entire stack of documents. The prosecution didn't just ask for death because they were angry.
No, they built a highly specific legal architecture to justify it, relying on something called the complex crime.
Right, and criminal law at this level requires immense structural precision. So how does this complex crime theory actually work?
Well, the prosecution invoked Article 48 of the Revised Penal Code. This article governs complex crimes and stipulates a very dangerous multiplier effect.
A multiplier effect, like stacking the crimes.
Sort of. It states that if a single act constitutes two or more grave or less grave felonies, or, and this is the hinge of their entire argument, if one crime is a necessary means for committing the other, the penalty for the most serious crime shall be imposed in its maximum period.
I see. And the maximum period for murder under the code at that time is capital punishment.
Exactly. So the prosecution's theory is that Ang Cho Kio didn't just happen to commit coercion and then separately happen to commit murder.
They argued he committed an inextricably linked hybrid offense, a complex crime of grave coercion combined with murder.
Right, the murder of the pilot, in their eyes, was the necessary means to enact the coercion of the hijacking.
Wait, I have to challenge the Supreme Court's ultimate rejection of this logic. Yeah. Because if Ang Cho Kio hadn't wanted to hijack the plane, he never would have shot the pilot.
That's certainly the intuitive view.
Right. The murder and the hijacking are totally glued together in his master plan. His motive for pulling the trigger was the diversion. Why didn't the court see the murder as a necessary means?
That is exactly the intuitive leap the prosecution hoped the court would make. They were trying to blur the line between a criminal's personal motive and the strict legal definition of necessity.
Oh, so motive and necessity aren't the same thing in the eyes of the law.
Not at all. The Supreme Court pulled out a judicial scalpel and severed the events. They ruled that these were distinct, successive acts.
Okay, so Act 1 is compelling the pilot to change course, and Act 2 is killing the pilot for non-compliance.
Exactly. They pointed out that Ang Cho Kio could have killed the pilot without ever uttering a word about Amoy. He proved that by killing the purser.
That's a dark but completely valid point.
And conversely, he could have continued coercing the pilot, perhaps by threatening the passengers, without actually pulling the trigger on the man flying the plane.
The court highlighted a dark, undeniable irony in the prosecution's argument, too. By killing the pilot, Ang Cho Kio absolutely destroyed any chance of achieving his primary goal.
You cannot divert an aircraft to Amoy if you execute the only human being on board who knows how to fly it.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Therefore, the murder was not a necessary means to commit the coercion. The murder was the definitive proof that the coercion had failed.
Right. He committed two distinct separate crimes: frustrated coercion and a completed murder.
To ground this in a more relatable analogy for you listening, think of a bank robber trying to crack the safe. He brings his tools, he works on the dial. That is crime number 1, attempted theft.
But the lock jams.
Right, it jams. He gets so furious that his coercion of the safe failed, he grabs a jerry can of gasoline and sets the entire bank on fire. That is crime number 2, arson.
And burning down the bank wasn't a necessary means to pick the lock.
In fact, burning the bank destroys the cash he was trying to steal. It wasn't a bundled, complex crime. It was just a sequence of terrible, cascading decisions.
I love that analogy. And the Supreme Court's logic here wasn't invented in a vacuum either. Because the Philippine Penal Code is heavily derived from the Spanish Penal Code of 1870, the justices looked backward across the ocean for historical precedent.
They cited 2 highly specific 19th century Spanish cases to prove that sequential violence does not equal a complex crime. The first one they say is from 1881, right?
Yes, an 1881 ruling from the Supreme Court of Spain. A man violently broke down the door of a house to gain entry, and once inside, he murdered a woman with whom he had previously had an illicit relationship.
And let me guess, the prosecution in that case tried to bundle it.
They did. They argued it was a complex crime of trespassing with homicide. The Spanish court firmly rejected it. Breaking the door was not a legally necessary means to commit homicide.
They were just two distinct criminal decisions born from the same violent episode.
Exactly. And they layer that with an 1885 Spanish case which deals with nighttime entry.
What happened in that one?
Two men arrive at a house at night demanding to, quote, enjoy the owner and her daughter. When they are denied entry, they force their way in, brutally assault the residents, cause severe injuries, and steal property on their way out.
Wow. But the Spanish court again ruled these were entirely distinct crimes, right? Trespassing, physical injuries, and theft.
Right. The violent sequence of an evening does not automatically glue disparate felonies into a single legal entity under the complex crime statute.
So, relying on the rigid definitions of necessity, the Philippine Supreme Court dismantled the prosecution's complex crime theory. The demand for the death penalty falls apart.
It completely collapses.
Before we move off this specific ruling, there is a paragraph in the Supreme Court's decision that genuinely gave me pause. It strips away the sterile legal mechanics and looks directly at the human element in that cockpit.
Oh, about Pilot Perlis.
Yes. The court writes about the profound moral weight placed on pilot Pedro Perlis. They note he was forced into a harsh alternative. He had to choose between obeying an illegal, terrifying order from a madman holding a gun to his head or dying.
Unimaginable choice.
And the court formally, permanently memorializes that the pilot chose not to be disloyal to his duty. He held his ground, he protected the integrity of his aircraft, and he paid for it with his life. It is a deeply somber moment of recognition buried in an ocean of technical jurisprudence.
It is a profound acknowledgement, and it perfectly sets the stage for the next massive legal hurdle in this story.
Right, because even though the Supreme Court agreed that the death penalty was off the table, the prosecution still had incredibly valid, mathematically sound arguments that the trial court sentences were legally too light.
But the Supreme Court hit a constitutional brick wall. They could not increase the sentences, no matter how much they might have agreed with the prosecution's math.
The double jeopardy dilemma. This is where the pure philosophy of law clashes violently with our visceral desire for perfect retribution.
It's a tough pill to swallow for a lot of people.
Yeah. The core issue before the court was this. Can the state, through the prosecution, appeal a trial court's sentence upward to correct a judge's mistake if that appeal exposes the convicted individual to an increased penalty for the exact same offense?
And the 1935 Philippine Constitution, alongside Rule 118, Article 2 of the Rules of Court, provided a blunt answer. No. It strictly prohibited placing a person twice in jeopardy for the same offense.
I was looking at the Anglo-American precedents the court leaned on here, specifically the landmark cases of Kepner v. United States and State v. Rook.
Very important cases.
From my reading, the crux of these precedents isn't about protecting criminals out of pity. It is an acknowledgement of the terrifying imbalance of power between a single citizen and the infinite resources of the state.
That is the exact philosophical bedrock. The history of Kepner is fascinating context here. Thomas Kepner was an American lawyer practicing in the Philippines in the early 1900s.
Okay, what did he do?
He was accused of embezzlement, tried, and acquitted by a court of first instance. The U.S. appellate system in the Philippines reversed the acquittal and convicted him.
Wait, so he was acquitted and they just tried again and got a conviction?
Yep. Kepner took it all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1904, arguing that even though the Philippines wasn't a U.S. state, American constitutional protections against double jeopardy applied.
And the Supreme Court agreed.
They did. They ruled that the state, with its endless funding, police forces, and prosecutorial armies, cannot continuously appeal verdicts until it gets the result it wants. The citizen would be bled dry, financially and psychologically.
So the rule is designed to force the state to get it right the first time. If the defendant appeals a sentence because they think it's too harsh, they willingly waive their jeopardy protection for that specific review.
Right, they open the door themselves.
They open the door and the higher court can look at it and say, well, actually, you're right, we're reviewing it, and your sentence was too light. We are increasing it.
But the prosecution cannot unilaterally pry that door open. The prosecution cannot initiate an appeal simply to correct a judge's misapplication of mitigating circumstances if it means the defendant receives a harsher punishment.
That makes sense, even if it feels unfair in this specific case.
Exactly. The court concluded that Ang Cho Kio had already been legally sentenced to 12 to 20 years for the purser's death and life for the pilots. Attempting to bump the 20-year sentence up to a second life sentence, even if the trial judge fundamentally misunderstood the law of premeditation, places Ang Cho Kio in jeopardy again.
The state only gets one shot.
The appeal is dismissed.
It is incredibly frustrating to see a cold-blooded murderer benefit from a judge's poor math. But that exact same technicality is the shield that protects innocent people from being dragged through endless retributive trials by a vindictive government.
The system accepts the flaw to preserve the shield.
It is the heavy price of a system that values the finality of justice and the protection of the individual over the absolute perfection of punishment.
But there is a fascinating footnote to this dismissal that we cannot ignore. The concurring opinion of Justice Cesar Bengzon.
Oh, Justice Bengzon is a towering figure in Philippine jurisprudence. He would eventually become the Chief Justice, and he was known for his fierce, uncompromising adherence to procedural propriety.
His concurring opinion in this case is essentially a polite but devastatingly sharp judicial reprimand to his own colleagues on the Supreme Court bench.
It really is. He basically calls them out.
Bengzon essentially says, look, I agree we must dismiss the state's appeal because of double jeopardy, but why on earth did we just spend pages and pages analyzing the complex crime theory and the Spanish precedents? Why was he so deeply annoyed by the majority's deep dive into Article 48?
Because Bengzon adhered strictly to the principle of actual controversy. In his view, if the Supreme Court has no constitutional jurisdiction to change Ang Cho Kio's sentence because of double jeopardy, then any discussion about what the sentence should have been is nothing but hot air.
Right.
He called the majority's lengthy analysis an advisory opinion or a declaratory judgment meant for the future guidance of trial courts.
He was calling them out for using a live murder case as a chalkboard to teach lower court judges a theoretical lesson.
Exactly. Bengzon pointed out that while rendering advisory opinions is a common and accepted practice in several U.S. state Supreme Courts, it is explicitly not authorized in Philippine constitutional law.
Philippine courts exist to resolve active, actionable controversies. If the court cannot alter the outcome, they have no business writing sprawling legal essays about the theory of the crime.
Right. They should have simply stated, double jeopardy applies, appeal dismissed, and ended the ruling there.
But punishing a crime after the fact with general murder laws and procedural debates wasn't stopping the bleeding. As we move forward from 1952, the aviation landscape fundamentally transforms, doesn't it?
Oh, entirely. Planes get massive, routes span oceans, and by the late 1960s, commercial flights weren't just being diverted by desperate individuals trying to escape to Amoy.
They're becoming prime targets for political leverage, international extortion, and terror.
The world was entering an era of systemic geopolitical vulnerability in the skies. You had incidents like the Dawson's Field hijackings in 1970 where multiple international jets were hijacked simultaneously.
Yeah, that was a wake-up call for the world.
The Philippine government realized their entire legal framework was reactive. They were trying to prosecute a 20th century geopolitical crisis using 19th century Spanish trespassing laws. They needed something proactive.
And that realization births Republic Act number 6235, approved on June 19th, 1971. This is the dawn of specific, targeted anti-hijacking legislation in the Philippines. It is a direct response to a global epidemic.
The text of this act reveals a legislature trying to build a legal cage around a moving object. Because an airplane isn't a static piece of real estate, the law had to define exactly when the jurisdiction of skyjacking begins and ends.
That's a tricky legal definition to pin down.
It is. Section 1 states an aircraft is legally in flight from the exact moment all its external doors are closed following embarkation until any of such doors is opened for disembarkation.
The closing of the door is the magic threshold. The moment that latch clicks, the legal reality of the physical space changes. And the state brought an incredibly heavy hammer to enforce it.
A very heavy hammer.
The base penalty for violating this act, just seizing control of a Philippine registry aircraft in flight, is set at 12 to 20 years imprisonment, or a fine ranging from 20,000 to 40,000 pesos.
And to understand the weight of that, you have to remember this is 1971 Philippine currency. A 40,000 peso fine was financially devastating.
It was designed to utterly bankrupt any individual or organization attempting this.
Exactly. Furthermore, the act establishes aggravated penalties. If you compel a change in course under certain violent circumstances, the state can push the penalty to 15 years, or all the way to death, alongside even heavier fines.
But the legislation doesn't just focus on the individuals holding the guns, it looks at the logistics. Sections 3 and 4 make it explicitly unlawful to ship explosives, flammable, corrosive, or poisonous substances on passenger aircraft.
And the law anticipates the defense of massive, faceless corporations saying, well, we didn't know what was in the cargo box.
Right. This is where the 1971 law introduces a radical shift toward holding corporations accountable. Sections 6 and 7 deal directly with liability.
If a juridical person, a legally registered corporation, violates the explosive bans, the state doesn't just issue a fine to the company's general fund. The law explicitly pierces the corporate veil.
They go after the individuals running the company.
Yep. The manager, the director, or the specific agent involved in accepting that cargo is held personally, criminally penalized.
And if it's a foreign airline operating in the Philippines?
The stakes are even higher. Not only is their resident agent penalized, but the foreign corporation can have its license to do business in the Philippines completely revoked.
Wow. The government is sending an unmistakable message to the airlines. You are the gatekeepers of the sky. You are responsible for what you load into the belly of your planes. And if you prioritize cargo revenue over security, we will shut your entire operation down.
It's a massive shift in responsibility.
But here is where this 1971 law intersects directly with your life today. Sections 8 and 9 of this act represent the exact moment the modern travel experience was born.
Prior to this, a passenger's luggage was largely considered private property, protected against arbitrary search.
Section 8 dismantles that privacy in the name of collective security. It explicitly authorizes airlines to open and investigate suspicious packages and cargoes, provided it is done in the presence of the owner.
And if the owner refuses to let the airline look inside,
the airline is granted the unassailable legal authority to refuse to load the cargo.
And Section 9 takes it directly to the individual passenger. It mandates that a specific warning must be printed on the ticket itself.
What does the ticket say?
It reads, "Holder hereof and his hand-carried luggage are subject to search for and seizure of prohibited materials or substances. Holder refusing to be searched shall not be allowed to board."
This is a profound legal mechanism that we all participate in today without a second thought. It functions almost exactly like a modern digital end-user license agreement, or EULA.
It really does. By purchasing the ticket, you are entering into a binding contract with the carrier. You are preemptively waiving a fundamental portion of your protections against search in exchange for the service of transportation.
The ticket is no longer just a receipt for payment. It is a legally binding contract of conditional surrender. You surrender your privacy to guarantee the collective safety of the metal tube.
So by 1971, the Philippines has built a formidable legal architecture. They have precise definitions, devastating penalties, aggressive corporate accountability, and the contractual absolute right to search every single passenger and piece of luggage.
The loopholes are closed.
Well, paper loopholes are closed.
Exactly. Because the real world, heavily armed and highly motivated, cares very little about the fine print on an airline ticket. Which brings us to the ultimate nightmare.
We jump forward 5 years to 1976. The political and social landscape of the Philippines has drastically escalated.
And the theoretical frameworks of the 1971 law are about to be stress tested in the most horrific way imaginable.
We are looking at the facts established in the Gacal case. The incident occurred on May 21st, 1976. This was a Philippine Airlines flight utilizing a BAC-111.
This is a much larger jet power aircraft compared to the propeller planes of the 1950s, right?
Right, designed for short-haul domestic routes. It was flying from Davao Airport in the southern Philippines, heading to Manila.
Let's look at the manifest. You have ordinary citizens, but also prominent figures in the local justice system. Among the passengers were Franklin Gacal, who served as a city fiscal, essentially a chief city prosecutor, and his wife, Corazon.
There was also Assistant City Fiscal Bonifacio Naslag and his wife Mansueta, and another passenger named Elma de Guzman.
Sitting among these prosecutors and citizens were 6 members of the Moro National Liberation Front, or MNLF. The Supreme Court documents record their names: Commander Zapata, Nasser Omar, Liling Pusuan Radia, Dimantong Demarosing, and Mike Randa.
And to ensure clarity for you listening, our focus in this deep dive is to remain entirely impartial regarding the complex historical, political, or ideological conflicts in Mindanao during this era.
Absolutely. Our focus is strictly on the factual timeline of the standoff and the subsequent legal shockwaves as they are recorded in the Supreme Court rulings.
And the factual timeline is staggering because it immediately highlights the catastrophic failure of the 1971 security protocols. These 6 men did not smuggle a couple of small pistols.
They brought a literal arsenal onto a commercial jet. They possessed 3 hand grenades, 2.45 caliber pistols and 1.22 caliber pistol.
Which immediately forces the question, how? How did 6 men walk past the ticket counter, bypass the 1971 law that mandated searches, and carry 3 hand grenades onto a jet?
We are going to dive deep into the legal answer to that question because it forms the entire crux of the multi-million peso lawsuit that follows. But first, we have to understand the absolute terror of the standoff.
Just 10 minutes after takeoff from Davao, at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, the hijackers stand up, brandish their weapons, and announce they are seizing control of the aircraft.
They breach the cockpit and direct the pilot to fly the BAC-111 to Libya from the southern Philippines.
The pilot is forced to try and explain the basic laws of physics to Commander Zapata. A BAC-111 is a regional jet. It literally does not possess the fuel capacity, the range, or the navigational equipment to cross multiple oceans and continents to reach North Africa.
It is physically impossible.
Facing the undeniable reality of the fuel gauges, the hijackers pivot. They demand to be flown to Sabah, Malaysia. But even that requires more fuel than the plane currently holds.
So the pilot diverts the aircraft, and they land at Zamboanga Airport at 3:00 p.m. for emergency refueling.
But Zamboanga was not a quiet pit stop. The moment the landing gear touches the tarmac and the plane begins to taxi, it is met by the full force of the state.
2 military armored cars surround the aircraft. Heavy machine guns are trained directly on the fuselage. The plane is stopped dead.
The hijackers issue their final demands to the military and Philippine Airlines representatives on the ground. They demand a long-haul DC aircraft capable of reaching Libya. They demand the president of Philippine Airlines be delivered to them as a hostage.
They demand $375,000 in cash, and they demand 6 Armalite rifles. If these demands are not met, they swear to detonate the hand grenades and vaporize the aircraft with everyone inside.
Put yourself in that cabin. You are a passenger trapped in a sealed metal tube on a concrete tarmac in Zamboanga. It is late May in the Philippines, which means the tropical heat and humidity are suffocating.
The standoff drags on, hour after hour, day after day, from Friday afternoon until Sunday, May 23rd. The passengers are held hostage without any substantial food or water.
Finally, on Sunday at 1:20 p.m., they are handed a quarter slice of a sandwich and 1/10 of a cup of water provided by the airline.
The physiological degradation and psychological terror inflicted on the passengers over those 3 days is unimaginable. And then the standoff breaks.
Relatives of the hijackers are brought to the tarmac and allowed to board the plane, presumably as a negotiation tactic or to verify the safety of the hijackers.
But as they are alighting the stairs, an armored car repositioning on the tarmac bumps the stairs of the aircraft.
A microscopic mechanical error, a driver's flinch, but in a powder keg, a spark is all it takes.
That bump triggers a catastrophic, chaotic reaction. It commences a massive gun battle between the military forces surrounding the plane and the heavily armed hijackers trapped inside.
The court records describe a scene of absolute carnage. The military unleashes a barrage of bullets into the aircraft. Inside the confined, crowded cabin, the hijackers detonate 2 of the hand grenades.
The toll is devastating. 10 innocent passengers and 3 hijackers are killed on the spot. 3 hijackers are captured alive. Elma de Guzman, the passenger we noted earlier, dies in the crossfire.
Corazon Gacal is forced to hurl herself out of the bullet-riddled plane to escape the grenade blasts, sustaining injuries that result in a 245 peso medical bill.
Mansueta Anislag suffers a fractured radial bone in her arm, requiring surgery and a 4,500 peso hospital stay. Franklin Gacal and Bonifacio Anislag escape without severe physical injury, but lose all their personal belongings in the destroyed fuselage.
It was a military intervention that resulted in a bloodbath. And when the smoke cleared and the survivors buried the dead, a new battle began, a battle for accountability.
The hijackers were either dead or imprisoned, immune to civil suits. The passengers, looking for justice, sued the entity they believed had fundamentally failed to protect them, Philippine Airlines.
The surviving passengers, led by the Gacals and the Anislags, file lawsuits. Civil cases 1701, 1773, and 1797. They sue PL, and they also named Judge Pedro Sampson C. Animas in the proceedings.
Their argument was clear, deeply emotional, and firmly rooted in the laws we just discussed. They pointed directly at the 1971 anti-hijacking law.
They argue that Pial was guilty of gross, wanton, and inexcusable negligence. Why? Because Pial failed to frisk the passengers adequately at the Davao airport.
They argued that in 1976, during an era where skyjacking was a known, prevalent, and globally recognized threat, failing to use a simple metal detector to find grenades was a complete dereliction of corporate duty.
And the foundational laws of the Philippines are heavily weighted in favor of the passengers in these scenarios. To understand the lawsuit, we have to look at Article 1733 of the Civil Code, which dictates the legal burden placed on common carriers.
The history of common carrier law goes all the way back to English common law regarding innkeepers and ferry operators, right?
Exactly. Under Philippine law, an airline is not just required to be reasonably careful. They are legally mandated to exercise extraordinary diligence. The law presumes that if a passenger is injured or killed while in their care, the airline is automatically at fault.
The burden of proof is totally inverted. The passenger does not have to prove the airline was negligent. The airline must mathematically prove they were not negligent.
You are presumed guilty until proven innocent when you were responsible for human cargo.
To escape civil liability and the payment of massive damages, the airline basically has two options. They must prove they exercised the utmost diligence of a very cautious person, or they must prove that the tragedy was caused by a caso fortuito.
A fortuitous event, more commonly known in global legal terms as force majeure, act of God, or an act entirely outside of human control.
Right. But Article 1174 defines force majeure with extreme rigidity. For an airline to claim force majeure, they can't just throw their hands up and say bad luck. The law demands a strict test.
First, the disaster has to be completely independent of the airline's will. PAL clearly didn't want the hijacking to occur. They didn't desire the destruction of their jet.
But the sticking point in the lawsuit was the second test, foreseeability.
And this is where the plaintiffs hammered them. They argued, skyjacking wasn't unforeseeable. It was happening all over the world. You should have frisked them. You had the legal right to search them under the 1971 law, and you failed.
But Powell's defense and the Supreme Court's ultimate ruling rested on a massive, undeniable contextual reality of the Philippines in 1976, the martial law context.
This is the piece of the puzzle that entirely absolves PAL of the negligence charge regarding the failure to frisk. In 1972, Ferdinand Marcos issued Proclamation 1081, placing the entire country under martial law.
By 1976, the armed forces of the Philippines had completely, unilaterally taken over all airport security operations. PAL was legally, physically, and operationally barred from running the security checkpoints.
The Supreme Court was presented with irrefutable documentary evidence of this military takeover. There was a letter dated October 20, 1973, from General Jose L. Rancudo of the Philippine Air Force, sent directly to the director of the Civil Aeronautics Administration.
And there was a subsequent letter of instruction, number 399, issued on April 28, 1976, just weeks before the Zamboanga hijacking.
These documents prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the military had assumed exclusive jurisdiction over frisking passengers, inspecting baggage, and maintaining the security apparatus at all airports, including Davao.
So the personnel who allowed 6 men with grenades onto the BAC 111 were not ticket agents employed by Philippine Airlines. They were military personnel assigned by the state.
Furthermore, once the plane landed in Zamboanga, the military immediately assumed absolute exclusive tactical control of the hostage negotiations and the subsequent disastrous armed assault. PAL executives were completely sidelined by the military command.
Think of it this way. Imagine you own a high-end jewelry store. You hire a private security guard to stand at your door and keep your customers safe.
Seems reasonable.
But one morning, the National Army rolls up in jeeps, physically removes your guard from the premises, and the commanding officer says, "By order of the government, we are guarding this door now. You have no authority here."
Okay.
Later that afternoon, an armed robbery happens. The robbers walk right past the soldiers. The traumatized customers then sue you, the store owner, for having bad security. Your defense would be bulletproof. I cannot be sued for failing to protect you when it was literally illegal for me to intervene. The state stripped me of my ability to provide security.
That analogy perfectly encapsulates the legal reality of the Gacal case. Because the government forcibly took over security operations, it satisfied the third and fourth strict requirements of force majeure.
The military takeover rendered it physically and legally impossible for PAL to fulfill its normal obligation to frisk passengers.
And crucially, PAL was completely free from any participation in the aggravation of the injury. PAL didn't accidentally bump the airplane stairs with an armored car. PAL didn't authorize the military to pepper the fuselage with machine gun fire.
The Supreme Court rules decisively in favor of Philippine Airlines. Because the state had assumed total control of the security apparatus, it rendered it impossible for the private corporation to perform its standard safety obligations.
The hijacking and the subsequent military shootout were entirely independent of PAL's operational will. Therefore, the absolute existence of force majeure was established.
Philippine Airlines was completely exempt from paying any civil damages to the Gacals, the Anislags, or the heirs of the deceased for the deaths, the horrific injuries, or the lost baggage.
It is a remarkably stark ruling. The passengers suffered unimaginable terror and loss, but the corporate entity they purchased their tickets from was legally untouchable, strictly because the state had placed itself between the airline and the passengers.
We have covered an immense amount of historical and legal ground today. Let's synthesize this journey. We started our deep dive in 1952 with the Ang Cho Kio case.
We looked at an era where a man could stroll onto a propeller plane with 2 pistols. It was treated as an isolated act of violence, and the legal debate was purely philosophical and criminal.
How do we properly classify a complex murder? And how does the Constitution protect a guilty man against double jeopardy when the state attempts to correct its own judicial math?
Then we watched the global landscape shift, bringing us to 1971. The state recognized the existential threat of skyjacking and attempted to legislate an invisible shield.
They defined the exact parameters of the crime. They threatened massive financial and penal consequences. They pierced the corporate veil to hold executives personally liable. And they transformed every airline ticket into a binding contract that stripped away passenger privacy in the name of security. They built a massive theoretical legal architecture.
And we ended in the suffocating heat of Zamboanga in 1976. Where those paper laws met the brutal reality of armed insurgency and martial law.
That tragedy proved that the most exquisitely drafted legislation cannot stop a smuggled grenade. And it established the chilling precedent that when the state steps in to take absolute exclusive control of security, the private airline is completely absolved of civil liability when that state security fails and innocent people die.
It is a complete evolution of liability. We moved from the individual criminal in 1952 to the attempt at corporate responsibility in 1971 to the absolute shield of state-controlled force majeure in 1976.
The scale of the threat expanded exponentially, and the legal liability shifted entirely away from the corporation, hiding in the shadow of the state's military power.
Which leaves us with a final lingering thought for you to carry with you the next time you walk through an airport terminal.
Modern aviation today relies on an incredibly complex, seamless blend of private airline policies and massive government security agencies, like the TSA or its international equivalents. The lines of responsibility are blurrier than ever.
You buy your ticket from a private for-profit corporation, but you are searched, scanned, and cleared by the state.
So, if the unthinkable happens tomorrow, if someone slips through that massive multi-billion-dollar high-tech net, who actually bears the ultimate responsibility? The airline that took your money or the state that promised to protect you?
It is a terrifying question. And as these documents prove, it is a question that the justice system usually only answers after the smoke has cleared.
Thank you so much to you, the listener, for providing such an incredible, complex stack of sources. This has been a truly fascinating deep dive into the hidden legal currents that run beneath every single flight we take. Keep asking the big questions.
Welcome to the debate. You know, usually when we talk about the architecture of the law, we use metaphors of the ground, bedrock principles.
Right, foundation.
Terra firma.
Exactly, terra firma.
Down here on the ground, legal boundaries are visible, and they're solid. But then, you take those same terrestrial laws, put them in a pressurized aluminum tube, flying at, 10,000 feet, and introduce an unprecedented, violent new reality.
Yeah, the airplane hijacking.
Right. Suddenly, the bedrock starts to crack. So what happens when 19th century laws meant for wooden doors and dirt roads are suddenly forced to deal with terrorists hijacking commercial airliners at gunpoint?
I mean, that is exactly the tension. We are looking at a space where traditional earthbound jurisprudence collides with the sheer terror and, honestly, the complexity of skyjacking. The legal system was just completely caught off guard.
Precisely. Today, we are looking at how early Philippine jurisprudence grappled with this exact problem in the 1950s and 1970s. We are exploring a really fascinating question.
Yeah, the core debate here.
Right. When dealing with the novel complexities of air piracy, did the Philippine Supreme Court correctly prioritize strict adherence to traditional legal doctrines? Or did this rigid formalism create an accountability vacuum that ultimately denied substantive justice to the victims?
And to look at this, we are pulling from a few foundational moments in the jurisprudence. We have the 1954 criminal decision El Pueblo de Filipinas v. Ang Cho Kio. which dealt with a horrific 1952 hijacking.
A truly brutal case.
It really was. We also have a major civil decision from 1990, Gacal v. Philippine Airlines, which addressed the liability fallout from a tragic 1976 hijacking. And, bridging those two eras is the 1971 anti-hijacking law.
I will argue that the strict application of established constitutional and civil doctrines correctly protects fundamental legal rights and accurately reflects the practical limits of institutional control, which must be maintained even in the face of novel crimes.
And I will argue that the mechanical application of 19th century penal concepts and blanket civil immunities to the complex terror of skyjacking obscures the true nature of these events and ultimately denies justice to the victims.
Let me begin by establishing my perspective here. The law cannot simply abandon its structural integrity just because a crime takes place in the air rather than on the ground.
Okay, but what does that mean in practice?
When you examine the Supreme Court's ruling in Ang Cho Kio, the court was absolutely correct to uphold the 1935 constitutional guarantee against double jeopardy. In that case, the state tried to appeal a conviction because they wanted to impose a heavier penalty.
Specifically, the death penalty.
Right, the death penalty. But relying on foundational precedents, the court rightly insisted that boundaries on state prosecutorial power are non-negotiable. You cannot place a man in jeopardy twice.
Even if the judge made a mistake.
Exactly. The same principle of maintaining doctrinal boundaries applies in the civil context of Gacal. Applying the doctrine of force majeure, an event outside the airline's control, accurately reflected the political and physical reality of the time.
Because of martial law.
Yes. Under martial law, the military had exclusive jurisdiction over airport security. Therefore, the breach of safety was fundamentally independent of the airline's will. The law worked exactly as it was designed to.
I come at it from a completely different way. That exact structural integrity you are praising resulted in profoundly absurd outcomes. It shielded responsible parties from proper accountability.
How so?
Well, in the criminal case of Ang Cho Kio, treating a continuous singular terror event, like the hijacking of a plane, as distinct successive acts, rather than a complex crime, artificially sliced up the reality of the situation.
You're saying the legal dissection was the problem.
Exactly. By legally dissecting the hijacking, the court essentially saved the perpetrator from the maximum penalty of death. And in the civil realm, granting Philippine Airlines a complete force majeure shield willfully ignores the statutory context of the 1971 anti-hijacking law.
The one that authorized searches.
Right. It explicitly authorized airlines to search passengers. By ignoring this and pointing the finger entirely at the military, the courts prioritized doctrinal purity over the actual safety and redress of the victims who suffered unimaginably.
Let us dive into the actual anatomy of that first crime in Ang Cho Kio. To understand the legal framework, we really have to look at the facts. It is December 30, 1952.
A commercial flight.
Yeah, commercial flight from Lawag to Apari. The accused shoots and kills the purser, Eduardo Diago. Then, in a separate act, he storms the cockpit and orders the pilot, Pedro Perles, to fly to Amoy, China.
And then he shoots him.
Right. When Perles refuses, the accused shoots and kills him too.
See, I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why we cannot look at those as separate acts. The prosecution rightly argued that this was a complex crime.
Grave coercion with murder, I believe.
Exactly. The coercion of the pilot to change course and the killing of the pilot when he refused are inextricably linked. The pilot was put in a brutal, unavoidable alternative. Comply or die.
Wait, hold on. I need to stop you there because I want to make sure we are clear on the mechanics of what makes something a complex crime under the law.
Sure.
It is not just a crime that is complicated, right? What is the actual statutory mechanism here?
Right, exactly. Under the revised penal code, a complex crime isn't just a complicated situation. The statute specifically applies when a single act constitutes two or more crimes.
Or when one is necessary for the other.
Yes, and this is the crucial part for our debate. When one crime is a necessary means to commit the other. So you have a situation where the criminality is essentially braided together. The prosecution argued that murdering the pilot and coercing the pilot were part of the same unitary event, air piracy.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. because bending the definition of a complex crime just because an airplane is involved erodes the precise mechanisms of the penal code.
But it was an airplane, not a...
Let me offer an analogy. Think of a complex crime, like breaking a car window to steal the stereo. The vandalism, breaking the glass, is the necessary means to commit the theft.
Right, you can't steal it without breaking in.
Exactly. You physically cannot steal the stereo without breaking the window. They are braided together. But in the airplane, Ang Cho Kio's murder of the pilot wasn't the necessary means to coerce him to fly to Amoy. It was the ultimate failure of the coercion.
I wouldn't call murder a failure of coercion. It's...
Legally speaking, he killed the driver so the vehicle stopped. The Supreme Court correctly pointed out that he could have killed Perlis without coercing him, and he could have coerced him without resorting to homicide.
But he didn't.
But they are two distinct acts: frustrated coercion and murder. Precision in identifying distinct acts is what separates the rule of law from mob justice.
But look at the jurisprudence the court used to justify separating those acts. To back up this extremely surgical, almost clinical separation of events, the court cited an 1881 Spanish Supreme Court case.
Which was the binding precedent at the time.
An 1881 case about a man breaking down a wooden door to assault a woman inside, where the Spanish court ruled that breaking the door and the assault weren't a complex crime.
The logic still holds up.
We are applying 19th century terrestrial logic, breaking a door in a house, to a man storming the cockpit of an aircraft in flight. When you point a gun at a pilot flying a plane and say, "Turn the plane," the violence and the coercion are one continuous act of terror.
Even so, separating them is what the text required.
By using that old terrestrial logic to surgically separate them, the court insulated the hijacker from the maximum penalty. If it were a complex crime, the law dictates that the penalty for the most serious offense be imposed in its maximum period, in this case, death. By splitting it up, he avoided that mandatory maximum.
The fact that the coercion happened in a cockpit instead of a living room does not change the fundamental mechanics of human causality. The law must categorize actions based on the objective facts of human agency, not the dramatic setting in which they occur.
But it's an entirely different kind of crime.
Whether you are on the ground or in the air, murder is not a necessary means to achieve a change in direction.
But this artificial fragmentation of the crime is exactly what led to the massive procedural failure that forms the core of this tragedy.
The sentencing issue.
Yes, because the trial court refused to see the event as a complex crime and instead treated it as separate, ordinary crimes. The trial judge completely bungled the penalties. For the first murder, killing the purser, the trial judge gave Ang Cho Kio a shockingly light sentence, 12 to 20 years.
And just to clarify for the listener, why was that 12 to 20-year sentence legally wrong?
Because the judge made an objective mathematical error under the revised penal code. The crime was murder with premeditation, which is an aggravating circumstance that pushes the penalty higher.
But he pleaded guilty.
Right, which is a mitigating circumstance. But the judge erroneously allowed the guilty plea to completely offset and wipe out the premeditation. Under the code, premeditation cannot be wiped out like that.
Ah, I see.
The sentence should have been much harsher. Reclusion perpetua at the very least. It was a glaring error by the trial judge.
Wait, let me play devil's advocate here, or rather, just voice what I imagine our listeners are screaming at their devices right now.
Go ahead.
If the guy pled guilty and the trial judge made a completely objective, clerical, mathematical error on the length of the sentence, why on earth couldn't the Supreme Court just fix the math?
Exactly. That is exactly what the prosecution asked them to do. The prosecution recognized the trial judge's error and appealed upward to the Supreme Court.
To fix the sentence?
Basically saying, please correct this math, give him reclusion perpetua for the first murder and death for the second. And the Supreme Court refused to correct it. They cited double jeopardy.
Which is a constitutional right.
But this is where formalism actively defeats justice. The state is appealing upward after a conviction. By applying the double jeopardy bar to an upward appeal of a flawed sentence, the court essentially said, yes, the judge violated the penal code in giving this murderer a light sentence, but our hands are tied.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because you are dismissing the double jeopardy clause as a mere technicality.
It functioned like one here.
Let us talk about the mechanics of double jeopardy, because usually we think of it simply as you can't be tried for the same crime twice if you're acquitted.
Right, the classic movie definition.
Exactly. But the mechanism goes much deeper. It also attaches to the punishment.
But jeopardy literally means risk of conviction. He was already convicted. He pleaded guilty. The risk of conviction was over.
But the risk of state harassment isn't. The Supreme Court drew heavily on foundational Anglo-American precedent, specifically the Kepner Doctrine. The logic is that a judgment in favor of the accused, even if it's just a favorable sentence resulting from a judge's error, is final.
Final even when wrong?
Think about the alternative. If we let the state appeal a 12-year sentence simply because the prosecutors want the death penalty, the state could keep dragging you back into court over and over, appealing and appealing until they finally get a judge willing to kill you.
That's a slippery slope argument.
It's the reality of state power. The state has infinite resources. The individual does not. Double jeopardy is the ultimate safeguard against state tyranny.
But applying that safeguard to protect an admitted terrorist from a mathematical correction of his sentence feels completely detached from the reality of the harm.
I think Justice Benzone's concurring opinion in this case is the definitive word here. He pointed out that the Supreme Court has no business rendering advisory opinions on what the correct penalty should have been if the case is procedurally barred from appeal.
Which leaves the public with a misapplication of justice.
The rule of law demands that we respect procedural boundaries, even when a trial judge makes a mistake. If we allow the state to break the rules to fix one judge's error, we break the shield that protects every citizen from malicious, endless prosecution.
Protecting citizens from the state is vital, yes. But that prioritization of procedural boundaries over the reality of the victims doesn't stop at the courtroom door for criminal trials.
You're thinking of the civil cases.
Right. The exact same logic bleeds directly into how the state treated the victims' physical safety and civil rights when the airlines themselves failed them. And that brings us to the 1990 case of Gacal vs. PAL, which deals with a horrific hijacking from 1976.
This is a great thematic transition because here we see the exact same demand for strict adherence to statutory elements, but this time in the civil code regarding common carriers and liability.
Let us look at the terrifying reality of what happened in Gacal. It is May 1976. 6 members of the Moro National Liberation Front board a Philippine Airlines BAC 111 flight in Davao.
Heavily armed, right?
Extremely. They are carrying 3 grenades, 2 .45 caliber pistols, and a .22 caliber pistol. They hijack the plane, demand to be flown to Libya, and eventually land in Zamboanga,
where the standoff happens.
The military completely surrounds the plane on the tarmac. After a tense standoff, an armored car literally bumps the stairs of the aircraft, which sparks a massive chaotic firefight. 10 passengers are killed, 3 hijackers are killed.
A total disaster.
And Corazon Cacao survives, but barely. She jumps out of the bullet-riddled plane as grenades are exploding inside. She later sues PAL for her hospital expenses, which amounted to a mere 245 pesos and 60 centavos, along with moral damages.
Wow. 245 pesos. That is shockingly low by today's standards, but obviously still a real out-of-pocket expense for a victim who went through an unimaginable trauma.
Exactly. It wasn't about bankrupting the airline. It was about the principle of accountability. But the trial court and later the Supreme Court dismissed her suit. They ruled that the hijacking and the subsequent military battle constituted a caso fortuito, or force majeure, an act of God, essentially.
To be precise, an unforeseen or unavoidable event that legally exempts someone from liability.
Right, which is incredibly unjust when you look at the timeline of aviation history. The plaintiffs argued that PAL absolutely should have foreseen this.
Because hijackings were common?
By the 1970s, hijackings were practically a global epidemic. Furthermore, the 1971 anti-hijacking law, Republic Act number 6235, had already been passed years prior.
And that law specifically addressed airport security?
Yes, Section 8 of that law expressly authorized airlines to open and investigate suspicious packages. Section 9 required every ticket to state that the passenger and their luggage were subject to search. Yet PAL didn't even use a simple metal detector at the Davao airport.
So you see that as a clear failure on their part?
To call 6 heavily armed men boarding a commercial flight an unforeseeable act of God when the airline had the explicit statutory power to search them is to reward gross negligence.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently based on the actual legal and political environment of the Philippines in 1976. Let's translate the legal jargon here.
Okay.
The law requires airlines to treat passenger safety with the highest possible diligence. The term is extraordinary diligence. But there's a flip side, the force majeure defense.
Right, the act of God.
If an event is entirely out of the airline's control, they aren't financially liable. It has to be independent of their will, unavoidable, and they cannot have participated in aggravating the injury.
And my argument is that failing to use a metal detector when you are statutorily authorized to do so means it was not unavoidable. By not searching them, the airline did participate in the negligence.
But you are ignoring who was actually running the airport in 1976. This didn't happen in a vacuum. This occurred during martial law.
The military presence, yeah.
General Jose Roncudo had issued a directive, later formalized by Letter of Instruction number 399, placing all airport security, all frisking, and all baggage inspection under the exclusive, absolute jurisdiction of the Armed Forces of the Philippines.
But PAL still had the statutory authority.
PAL literally had no legal or operational jurisdiction to perform the searches you are demanding. The military took over the airports. So when the military assumes exclusive control over security, and then the military security apparatus fails to stop armed hijackers from boarding, that failure cannot legally become the airline's financial burden.
It's a convenient excuse.
The elements of force majeure were met perfectly. It was physically and legally impossible for PAL to perform its security obligations in a normal manner.
Think about the tragic absurdity of the accountability vacuum you just described. Let us map this out from the victim's perspective.
All right.
The state assumes total control of airport security. The state fails miserably, allowing terrorists with hand grenades onto a commercial flight. Then, the state's military escalates the situation on the tarmac by ramming the stairs with an armored car.
Causing a firefight?
Right, causing a crossfire that kills 10 innocent passengers. And finally, the state's courts step in and completely absolve the corporate carrier of any liability, specifically because of the state's intervention.
It is not absurdity. It is a strict, objective accounting of liability. PAL did not point the guns. PAL did not sneak the grenades past the military.
But they let them on the plane.
And PAL certainly did not bump the stairs with an armored car to start a firefight.
But the rigid application of force majeure leaves Corazon Gacal with bullet wounds, a traumatizing escape, and zero redress. When the courts allow a blanket corporate immunity under the guise of martial law military control, they signal to airlines that they have zero incentive to push back.
Push back against the military? Under martial law?
Yes, to demand better security or to protect your own passengers. Republic Act 6235 gave airlines the authority to refuse loading if someone wouldn't be searched. The statutory tools were there.
Tools they couldn't use.
The courts simply chose to honor the martial law military monopoly over the text of the anti-hijacking law and the mandate for extraordinary diligence.
The civil law mandates that you cannot hold a party liable for events beyond their control. What you are calling an accountability vacuum is simply the court refusing to invent a deep pocket to pay damages when the actual liable party is gone.
The hijackers?
Right, the hijackers, and perhaps the state's military, who are either dead or immune from suit. It is a harsh, brutal reality. I concede that.
It is deeply brutal.
But stretching the law to force an airline to pay for a military firefight destroys the predictability of contracts and civil liability.
Predictability for the corporation, perhaps, but total unpredictability for the passenger, whose life is literally in their hands. In both the criminal context of Ang Cho Kio and the civil context of Gacal, we see the exact same pattern playing out.
The adherence to formalism.
Exactly. The courts encounter a highly complex, terrifying modern crime, the hijacking. Instead of adapting the law to meet the reality of the threat, by recognizing a continuous, complex crime that demands the maximum penalty, or by demanding proactive corporate responsibility despite military presence, to jurisprudence retreated into safe, formalistic boxes.
Let's bring our positions into focus as we wrap up. I maintain that keeping these rigid legal frameworks intact is vital, precisely because hard cases make bad law.
Even when victims suffer.
Whether it is the constitutional double jeopardy clause protecting an individual from endless state appeals, or the civil law's strict elements for a force majeure protecting a carrier from liability in a military-controlled environment, boundaries matter. Courts must adjudicate based on the exact text of the law and the objective facts of who possesses operational control.
I hear you, but
Bending the rules of criminal procedure or civil liability simply to achieve an emotionally satisfying result against terrorists or to find a way to compensate victims at the expense of an airline with no jurisdiction damages the entire legal system.
And I maintain that when faced with the modern, complex terror of skyjacking, the mechanical application of old penal concepts and blanket corporate immunity created a deeply unbalanced system.
By strictly adhering to the text.
By slicing up a hijacking into discrete terrestrial crimes, using 19th century precedents about wooden doors, the court allowed a murderer to escape the maximum penalty. And by allowing martial law directives to completely override the extraordinary diligence required of common carriers, the courts left victims of massive disasters entirely uncompensated. Formalism without context isn't justice. It's an abdication of the court's duty to see the reality of the harm.
Yet, despite our differing perspectives on how the Supreme Court handled these specific cases, I think we find a point of strong convergence here. Both Ang Cho Kio and Gacal v. Pal demonstrate the immense, sometimes system-breaking strain that novel, technologically enabled crimes put on existing legal architectures.
Absolutely. These cases are perfect time capsules. They show us a legal system scrambling to understand a threat it just wasn't built for.
Trying to fit a square peg into a round hole.
Exactly. It reflects that the struggle to balance formal legal rights with substantive justice is an ongoing evolution. It suggests there is so much more to explore and how aviation and security law developed in the decades after these tragic events, as the world learned from these exact failures.
Indeed, the law is always racing to catch up to human invention, and, unfortunately, human malice. Which brings us back to where we started.
To the ground.
Right. When the doors of that pressurized aluminum tube close and the aircraft leaves the terra firma behind, does the law remain safely on the ground, or can it stretch to the sky without breaking? That is something we will leave for you to consider.
Thank you for listening.